In the last video I got as far as reassembling the keyboard encoder unit. I've now refitted that to the base. I've refitted the positioning brackets, and this can now be put to one side while I work on the transmitter unit. This is the transmitter unit. It sits at the left hand end of the keyboard. It's not working at the moment. This gear is supposed to drive this cam around. There's a one-way clutch and a free-wheel drive on here, and when you press this lever down, what's supposed to happen is it should engage this drive, and it's not going round. So either there's a damaged gear in here, or there's something else not working. Also, most of the parts are seized or partially seized, so this is supposed to be on the light spring, but it's quite hard to move at the moment. So the rest of it doesn't seem too bad. The switches seem to operate in the way that they should, although they're very slow to move. And sometimes this one is sticking slightly as well. So you can see when I push this down, this is supposed to move over, and then a spring should pull it back. But it's again not working. It seems fairly clean, but it's just a bit sticky. So I'll dismantle this, get it cleaned, I'll reassemble it. I won't show that in detail. I'm sure everyone's getting fairly bored with these videos now, so I'll get that done off camera, get it working. I'll just give a quick description of what I find. I'll explain how it works, and then I can refit this to the keyboard, and that will just leave the identification unit, and we can then refit the keyboard to the printer. I now have the transmitter unit dismantled. I've cleaned all the parts, freed up all the pivots and bearings. I've got the switches working. I thought it might just be interesting at this point to show how the transmitter actually works. But what we have are two switches, two pole switches. The top one is triggered whenever the transmitter needs to run. That's just the run switch for the unit. The bottom one is the marked space switch. So this is what is responsible for sending out the encoded data. So on the left we have the space switch or space contact, and on the right we have the mark contact. So whenever the switch is to the left, it's the unit's outputting a 0. Whenever the switch is to the right, the unit's outputting a 1. And that is just controlled by this rocker. So this rocker will move back and forth, and I don't know if you can see it, but it's causing the switch to change from one side to the other. The mechanism is really a bit over complex, but it's to ensure a fast switch with minimal bounce. You don't want a slow moving switch when there's a lot of inductance in the circuit. And bear in mind, this does directly drive the receiver at the far end of the wire. So there are no amplifiers or anything in between. This is a direct link. Some units do have relays, but fundamentally it might be driving another teleprinter directly. So the way it works, if you recall from the previous video, there are a series of fingers on the keyboard encoder, and they come in about this level, and they sit just where the end of these lever arms end. And if you also recall, if the lever on the keyboard was to the right, that represented a digit of 1, and if the bar was to the left, it represented a value of 0. So they're bit values. So this is quite simple in the way it works. It's got some complications just because of the extra features it needs, such as the ability to freewheel, etc. I fitted just one of the cam pulls at this point, but normally there are 6. So these all run in a cam slot. So there is a 6-slot cam here. The others are, it's probably very hard to see, but they are cams with a single recess in them, so a single point in the rotation, and the cam has a drop in it, and they're all sequenced so that each of the levers in turn has the option to drop down into the cam. So if I turn it with this cam, you'll see that as it approaches the dimple, the cam drops down, and then as the cam continues to rotate, it's raised again. Now of course, if there's a bar here from the keyboard encoder, then it won't drop down. There's a spring trying to pull these down all the time, but it will try to drop down into the recess in the cam. But if the lever from the keyboard encoder is underneath here, then it won't be able to drop down. And that's really the key to how it works. So each of these encoder bars sits over one of these slots in the cam. When we press a key, it triggers this unit to start rotating. It then rotates in such a way that each of the cam levers in turn has the option to drop into its slot. If there's an encoder bar holding it up, it won't drop. If there's no encoder bar under, then it will drop down into its recess as it's done there. The effect this has, if we now move to the switch, is the switch is normally in a space position, so it's normally over to the left. When I rotate this, you see each time we get this timing cam which tries to operate the switch. If the respective pull is high, then the switch will stay in the space position. But if, as in this case, let's assume that there's a 1 required, so the bar's not underneath the end of this cam, or cam lever should I say, then it will drop down, and when it drops down, it's now dropping, it causes the switch to change states. If you keep an eye on the switch, you'll see it's now changed to a mark, and then it will immediately change back again, so its resting place is in the space position, and then it will go around again. If I do a full revolution, but this time I'll hold this pull up as if though there is an encoder bar underneath the end, you see that it doesn't drop down, and hence we get a 0. And once again, if we assume that the encoder bar is not there, it will drop down. The switch has changed state, so we're sending out a 1 now, and that's how it works. It just does that for each of the 5 encoder bars in turn. If there's an encoder bar holding this up, it sends a 0. If it's allowed to drop down because the bar's out of the way, it will send a 1. Something I've just spotted that might be of interest to some who are interested in the historical relevance of these is, don't know how well this comes out on camera, but there's some initials written down here. So it looks like AV, so it would be very interesting to know who AV was and when that was written. It was possibly put there 90 years ago, so maybe of some historical relevance to somebody. Okay, so that's the transmitter reassembled, lubricated. It's now ready to be fitted back to the keyboard. Just to give a quick demonstration of it going through a full cycle before I refit it. So as I say, the encoder fingers from the keyboard sit underneath these levers, and this linkage here is the one that is triggered by the bar that is pressed down whenever a key is pressed on the keyboard. So it normally sits about here, but when you press a key on the keyboard it goes down, and that starts the entire transmission cycle. So this is driving all the time, but it's in its idle state until a key is pressed. When a key is pressed, this will go down, the lever raises. This is what wasn't working before. There was a bent link. I think it had just seized up, and when it was turned at some point it bent a little linkage, and so it wasn't raising this. But once that raises, it starts the cycle off, and then it will go through all of the fingers in turn. They effectively check to see the position of the encoder bars on the keyboard, and then they will put the switch either in the mark or space position depending on the position of these fingers, which, as I say, depends on the setting on the encoder bars. It will go through the entire cycle, one finger at a time, get back to the start, and then it will stop. The other thing it will do is there's an extra lever here. This top switch is a run switch, so as soon as the cycle starts, this momentarily changes state, and that's used to trigger a distant receiver. Once it's been triggered, it can go back to its idle state, because once the distant machine is running, it will complete the current cycle. So again, I'll start it and you'll see this has momentarily changed state. So it's now changed the opposite state. And it goes right through the entire cycle and finishes. Okay, so I'll get this fitted back to the keyboard, just briefly explain it working within the keyboard, and then it's on to the last two small modules and the entire machine is finished. So that's the transmitter reattached to the keyboard. I've also refitted the door for the switches. This has been repainted as well. I've tried to get a good match between the paint. Obviously this is the old paint, this is the new, so it's a reasonably good match. So just a quick demonstration now. The keyboard is pretty much complete. The only things missing now are the answer back encoder unit and the character counter. The machine will work fine without those two units fitted, but I will restore those and fit those next. They're quite simple units. So the way the keyboard works, when you press a key, the lever that the key is attached to is obviously depressed and moves down. But several other things happen as well. The bar that runs across the front, incidentally I've left the front cover off at the moment just so you can see this working. But the bar that runs across the front, that's the one with all the holes in it, moves down. That's the bar that operates the start transmit lever in the transmitter, and that allows the transmitter to begin the overall cycle. This gear is normally turning all the time. I'll just run it through to the end of the current cycle. So it normally runs like this. This is in idle, and the gear just spins around, doesn't do anything. But when you press a key down, several things happen. Firstly, the transmitter is put into transmit mode. So I'll press any key, the lever's gone down, the transmitter now enters the transmit state, and you can see it will begin to process the levers and the bits one by one. Another thing that's happened is this bar that runs along the back has moved forward. And what that's for is to stop you pressing any more keys, so it blocks you from pressing any more keys down while the current key is being processed. Notice the current key has been latched down by the latch bar at the back of the keyboard. So that's the sixth encoder bar in effect. Also, although you can't see them now, the encoder bars have moved to their encoded position for this key, and the transmitter unit will now cycle through and check the position of the encoder bars. You can just see the tips of them here, so you can see that a couple are going to block these levers and the others are going to miss the levers and allow a 1 to be sent. So if we watch it cycling through the 5 bits, you'll see that as it comes to each one, the first one has gone down, so that's a 1. The next one can't go down because the lever's in the way. It's gone down a little bit, but it's now hit the lever. That's a 0. The next one's a 0. The next one's gone all the way down, so that's a 1. And the next one goes all the way down, so that's a 1. When it gets to the end of the cycle, what it's going to do is move this bar across. That's normally attached to the character counter that sits over here. It's also going to move across the latch bar at the back of the keyboard. That will do two things. It will enable the key to return to the up position, and it will also move this blocker bar out of the way so another key can then be pressed. You need this especially in a system like this that runs fairly slowly, because you can out-type this machine if you're a good typist and you don't want to press the next key until it's finished processing the current one, otherwise you get weird data going out. So we'll run through to the end of the cycle, and you'll see that as it reaches the end of the cycle, the keyboard is reset and returns to normal. It's gone back into its idle state, so now this gear just spins around and it's ready to accept the next key press. And it's as simple as that. This lever is just to reset the character counter. So when you do a carriage return, this comes down and the character counter sits here, and this causes it to reset. Okay, so that's the keyboard. I'll do the next two modules, get those fitted, and then I'll come back on camera and just quickly demonstrate how they work, and then I can refit this entire unit to the Teleprinter, give it a test, and then our 7B is complete. And just a quick look at it with the front cover refitted, and as you can see it's looking quite tidy now.